The sound of her baby's cries pierced the still desert night like a knife, and Lillian Harper pressed her forehead against the cabin window, tears streaming down her face as exhaustion claimed every inch of her body. 3 nights without sleep had left her hollow-eyed and desperate, her nerves frayed to breaking point as little Thomas wailed relentlessly in his handmade crib. "Please, sweetheart," Lillian whispered, lifting the 7-month-old into her arms. "Please rest just for a little while." The Arizona Territory of 1876 was no place for a widow with a colicky baby. When her husband died in a mining accident 4 months ago, Lillian had been certain she could manage on her own. She'd always been strong, the daughter of pioneers who'd crossed half the continent before she was 10 years old. But tonight, as Thomas's cries grew more insistent, she felt her resolve crumbling. The knock at her door startled her so badly she nearly dropped the baby. "Who's there?" She called, her voice tight with fear. Raiders weren't uncommon in these parts, and a woman alone made an easy target. "Blake Granger, madam, from the Double Creek Ranch next property over." Lillian hesitated, clutching Thomas tighter as his wails intensified. She'd seen Blake Granger in town a few times, tall and broad-shouldered with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he tipped his hat to her. He had a reputation as a fair employer and an honest rancher. With Thomas's cries reaching a fever pitch, she made her decision and unlatched the door. Blake Granger stood on her porch, hat in hand, concern etched across his weathered face. At 32, he had the look of a man who'd spent his life under the western sun-tanned skin, light brown hair streaked with gold, and eyes the color of the sky just before dusk. "I was riding fence line and heard the little one," he said, his voice gentle. "Thought maybe something might be wrong." Lillian tried to respond, but exhaustion and emotion choked her words. Instead, tears welled up and spilled over before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she managed, bouncing Thomas desperately. "He hasn't stopped crying for 3 nights. I've tried everything. He's not sick, not hungry, he just won't." Her voice broke as Thomas let out another piercing wail. Blake's expression softened. "May I come in, Mrs. Harper?" She nodded, stepping back to allow him into the modest cabin. The single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom with a small rocking chair positioned near the wood stove. "Would you let me try something?" he asked, shrugging off his worn leather coat. "My sister had 6 young-uns, and I helped her with all of them." Desperation overrode caution. Lillian carefully transferred her red-faced, screaming son into the cowboy's arms. Blake cradled the baby with surprising ease, his large hands secure yet gentle. "Hello there, little man," he murmured, his deep voice pitched low and soothing. "That's quite a set of lungs you've got." He began to sway, a natural rocking motion that seemed to come from years of practice. His movements were fluid, confident as he paced the small cabin floor. "Why don't you sit for a spell, Mrs. Harper?" he suggested, nodding toward the rocking chair. "I'll rock him until morning comes if need be." Too exhausted to protest, Lillian sank into the chair, watching as this stranger, this unexpected savior, walked circles with her son. Blake hummed softly, an old trail song she vaguely recognized, and within minutes, Thomas's cries began to subside. "How did you?" She began, watching in astonishment as her son's eyelids grew heavy. Blake smiled, still swaying gently. "Sometimes they just need a different set of arms." "My sister swore it was because men run hotter, something about the warmth helping with their bellies." As Thomas's breathing finally evened out in sleep, Lillian felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," Blake said softly, careful not to disturb the now sleeping infant. "But I reckon you could use some rest yourself. I'll keep holding him while you get some sleep." "I couldn't ask you to, you're not asking, I'm offering." His smile was gentle but firm. "I'll rock him until morning comes." Lillian wanted to protest, but exhaustion pulled at her with irresistible force. She nodded, stumbling toward the bed in the corner. "Thank you, Mr. Granger," she whispered, collapsing onto the quilt-covered mattress. "Blake," he corrected quietly. "Just Blake." "Blake," she repeated, her eyes already closing. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the striking image of the tall cowboy cradling her baby in the soft glow of the oil lamp, rocking him with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When Lillian awoke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember why this felt so unusual, and then it hit her. She'd slept. For hours. Uninterrupted, she sat up quickly, eyes darting to the crib, but it was empty. Panic surged through her until she spotted Blake, sitting in the rocking chair by the stove, Thomas sleeping peacefully against his chest. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice rough with tiredness. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his smile was warm. "Little fellow finally gave in around midnight, been sleeping like an angel since." Lillian pushed her tangled hair from her face, embarrassment flooding her cheeks. "You stayed all night," said I would, he replied simply, "and I always keep my word." She stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress. "You must be exhausted and hungry. Please let me make you breakfast. It's the least I can do." Blake carefully rose, transferring Thomas to the crib with practiced ease. The baby stirred but didn't wake. "Wouldn't turn down coffee if you've got it," he admitted, stretching his tall frame. In the morning light, Lillian could see the fine lines around his eyes, the strength in his hands as he replaced his hat. Of course. She busied herself at the stove, grateful for something to do that would hide her flushed face. A stranger had spent the night in her home, a man she barely knew beyond reputation. What would people say? Yet as she stole glances at him standing by the crib, watching Thomas with gentle eyes, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "Do you have family nearby, Mrs. Harper?" Blake asked as she handed him a steaming cup. "Lillian, please," she corrected. "And no, my parents are in Missouri. My husband James was all I had here." She swallowed against the familiar tightness in her throat. "The mining accident took him 4 months ago." Blake's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss. These territories can be hard on folks, especially those facing them alone." "We manage," Lillian said, lifting her chin with the pride that had kept her going. "Thomas and I." "No doubt about that," Blake agreed, sipping his coffee. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." She met his eyes, surprised by the absence of pity she usually saw when people learned of her situation. Instead, there was respect in his gaze and something else she couldn't quite name. "I should check on my cattle," he said, setting down the empty cup. "But if you'd permit me, I'd like to stop by this evening, bring some supper maybe, in case the little one has another rough night." Propriety dictated she refuse. A widow living alone couldn't entertain a bachelor without raising eyebrows, but propriety hadn't rocked her son to sleep or given her the first real rest she'd had in days. "We'd like that," she said finally. "Thank you, Blake." His smile warmed something inside her that had been cold for months. Until this evening, then. After he left, Lillian stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching his figure ride away across the scrubby landscape. Thomas began to stir in his crib, but for the first time in days, his waking sounds were soft coos instead of cries. Blake returned that evening with a basket of food from his ranch, cook-fresh biscuits, a jar of preserves, and a pot of stew that filled her small cabin with mouth-watering aromas. He'd also brought a contraption made of bent wood and canvas that he called a baby swing. "Rigged it up today," he explained as he hung it from one of her ceiling beams. "My sister swears by these, says the swaying motion is like being in the saddle, puts them right to sleep." Lillian watched in amazement as he demonstrated, placing Thomas in the swing and giving it a gentle push. The baby's eyes widened in surprise before his face split in a delighted grin. "He loves it," she breathed, watching her son kick his legs in excitement. Blake's answering smile made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt since before James died. It was a disorienting sensation, guilt mingling with a warm spark of interest she wasn't ready to examine. They ate together at her small table, with Thomas contentedly swinging nearby. Blake told her about his ranch, about coming to Arizona territory 10 years earlier with nothing but determination, and the horse he rode in on. "Double Creek's not the biggest spread, but it's mine," he said with quiet pride. Got 15 hands working for me now, and we're turning a good profit on the cattle drive each year. It's impressive what you've built, Lillian said sincerely. James always dreamed of having his own land someday. He chose mining instead, the quickest way to make money, he thought. She sighed, looking down at her hands. We were saving to buy a little plot, maybe start a small farm. He wasn't meant to be underground. Blake nodded, understanding. Not many men are. Takes a special kind of courage. Or desperation, Lillian added softly. As evening settled into night, Thomas began to fuss. Blake stood without being asked, lifting the baby from the swing and settling him against his shoulder. What will you do now? He asked as he paced the floor, patting Thomas's back with gentle rhythm. Stay here. Lillian busied herself clearing the dishes. I don't know, the cabin's paid through winter after that. She trailed off, the uncertainty of her future stretching before her like the vast desert outside. There's work in town, maybe I can sew, cook decent enough. Blake was quiet for a long moment, just the sound of his boots on the wooden floor filling the silence. My ranch could use a good cook, he said finally. The hands would appreciate something better than what Mick serves up. Man can wrangle a steer but burns water. She looked up, startled by the offer. I couldn't possibly, there's a small house, he continued. Was meant for the foreman, but he prefers staying in the bunkhouse with the others. It's sitting empty. You and Thomas would have privacy, safety, decent wage. Why would you do this for me? Lillian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You hardly know me. Blake's eyes met hers, steady and clear. Because I know what it's like to be alone out here, and because, he glanced down at Thomas, who was falling asleep against his shoulder. Because no one should have to face the territories without help, not even the strongest among us. Something in his words, in the gentle way he held her son, broke through the walls Lillian had built around her heart since James died. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. I don't need charity, she said, pride stiffening her spine. It's not charity, it's a fair exchange, Blake countered. You cook, keep house, get paid an honest wage. The offer would stand for anyone with your skills. His expression softened. But I won't pretend I'm not especially hoping you'll accept. The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Lillian felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. I'll think about it, she promised. That night, after Blake left and Thomas was sleeping soundly in his crib, Lillian sat by the window, looking out at the stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky. James had loved those stars, had pointed out constellations to her on their walks home from church socials. What should I do, James? She whispered to the empty room, but there was no answer, only the quiet breathing of her son and the distant howl of a coyote. By morning, she had made her decision. Blake arrived a week later with a wagon to move Lillian's belongings to the Double Creek Ranch. It wasn't much. The furniture belonged to the cabin's owner, but she had her clothes, Thomas's things, her mother's china that had survived the journey west, and James's books. Is this everything? Blake asked, securing the last trunk. Lillian nodded, holding Thomas on her hip as she took a final look at the cabin that had been her home for the past year. She felt a pang of something like regret, but also relief. This place held too many memories of James, too many nights of tears and loneliness. Ready then? Blake asked softly. Ready, she confirmed, letting him help her up onto the wagon seat. The journey to Double Creek took nearly 3 hours. Thomas, entranced by the motion of the wagon and the new sights, remained cheerful throughout, babbling and pointing at hawks circling overhead. He's a curious one, Blake observed, smiling as the baby reached for his hat. Too curious sometimes, Lillian agreed, catching Thomas's hand before he could grab Blake's ear. Their fingers brushed, and she felt that same flutter in her chest, stronger now. Double Creek Ranch spread across a valley with rolling hills in the distance. A creek, two branches meeting to form one, Lillian realized, understanding the name cut through the property, lined with cottonwoods and willows. Cattle grazed on the grass-covered lowlands, and in the distance, she could see cowboys on horseback moving among the herds. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure built of wood and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Nearby stood a barn, bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings, and there, just beyond the main house, was a smaller cabin with freshly painted shutters. "That's yours," Blake said, following her gaze, "if you like it." "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Wait until you see inside." "My boys have been working on it all week." As they pulled up to the cabin, Lillian saw several cowboys hovering nearby, curiosity evident in their expressions. They nodded respectfully as Blake helped her down from the wagon. "Mrs. Harper, these are some of my hands," Blake said. "Mick, my current cook, who'll be mighty relieved to see you. That's Hank, Pete, and Caleb." The men removed their hats, murmuring greetings. Lillian noticed the curious looks they exchanged, clearly wondering about her presence, but their manners were impeccable. "Mrs. Harper will be taking over the cooking and housekeeping duties," Blake explained. "She and her son Thomas will be living in the foreman's cabin." "Welcome to Double Creek, madam," said the oldest of the cowboys, Mick, she presumed. "You're a sight for sore eyes." "These boys are tired of my cooking, though they're too polite to say it." "Speak for yourself," one of the younger men teased. "I've been saying it for months." The easy camaraderie between them reminded Lillian of how isolated she'd been at the mining camp and later at the cabin. She found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in what felt like forever. "I'll do my best not to disappoint," she promised. "Boys, help bring Mrs. Harper's things inside," Blake instructed. "Then give her some space to get settled." The cowboys quickly unloaded her belongings, carrying them into the cabin with careful hands. Lillian followed, gasping softly as she stepped inside. The cabin was simple but charming, much larger than where she'd been living. A sitting room with a stone fireplace opened to a kitchen with a proper stove. A door led to a bedroom with a new-looking bed frame, and off that was a smaller room where someone had already set up Thomas's crib. Most touching of all were the fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table and a handmade wooden toy, a little horse on wheels sitting on the windowsill. "The boys wanted to welcome you proper," Blake said softly from behind her. "Caleb's good with woodworking, made that for Thomas." Tears pricked Lillian's eyes. "It's all so lovely, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll make us some decent biscuits," one of the cowboys called from outside, earning a round of laughter. "I'll let you get settled," Blake said. "Supper's at 6 in the main house. But if you're too tired tonight, one of the boys can bring something over." "No, we'll be there," Lillian assured him. "After all, I should see what I'm working with." After Blake and the cowboys left, Lillian sat on the edge of the new bed, Thomas crawling happily at her feet, exploring his new surroundings. She felt overwhelmed by the kindness she'd been shown, yet anxious about this new chapter. "What do you think, little one?" she asked her son. "Did we make the right choice?" Thomas looked up at her with James's eyes and smiled his sunshine smile, and Lillian felt her heart expand with love and hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would be all right. That evening, Lillian bathed Thomas and dressed them both in their best clothes before walking the short distance to the main house. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and the sound of men's voices and laughter drifted into the twilight. Her arrival caused a momentary hush as the cowboys, cleaned up from their day's work, stood respectfully. Blake emerged from what appeared to be his study, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Mrs. Harper," he said warmly, "and young Master Thomas, welcome." The dining room could accommodate all 15 ranch hands, though Blake explained that usually only half ate at the house at any time, with the others out with the herds. Tonight, it seemed everyone had found a reason to be present, curious about the new addition to their community. Dinner was a lively affair. The men were on their best behavior but clearly comfortable with each other, trading good-natured barbs and stories of the day's work. They made efforts to include Lillian, explaining ranch operations and asking polite questions about her background. Thomas, sitting on her lap, became the center of attention, charming the rough cowboys with his smiles and babbling. Even the most weathered among them melted when the baby reached for them with his chubby hands. "Never seen so many grown men turned to mush by one little tyke," Blake commented, his eyes twinkling as he watched his foreman making silly faces at Thomas. "He has that effect," Lillian agreed, feeling a strange pride at how easily her son won over the rugged ranchers. After dinner, as the men filtered out to the bunkhouse or to evening duties, Blake walked Lillian and Thomas back to their cabin. The night was cool, stars brilliant overhead, coyotes calling in the distance. "Thank you for tonight," Lillian said as they reached her door. "Your men are kind." "They're good boys, mostly," Blake agreed. "Rough around the edges, but decent hearts." He hesitated, then added, "They respect you already. It takes a special kind of courage to start over like you're doing." His words warmed her more than they should have. "Necessity more than courage," she demurred. "I disagree." Blake's voice was soft but firm. "Plenty of widows in your situation would have gone back to family, taken the easy road. You chose to make your own way. That's courage, Mrs. Harper." "Lillian," she reminded him. "If I'm to work for you with me," he corrected gently. "Not for me." The distinction felt important somehow. Lillian looked up at him, really looked, and saw something in his expression that made her breath catch admiration, yes, but something more. Something that made her both nervous and exhilarated. "Good night, Blake," she said softly, suddenly needing distance from these confusing feelings. "Good night, Lillian," he replied. "Sleep well." As autumn progressed into winter, Lillian settled into life at Double Creek Ranch. Her cooking was met with enthusiastic appreciation from the Cowboys, and she found satisfaction in creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere in the main house. Thomas thrived in the ranch environment, doted on by 15 surrogate uncles who competed for his smiles and celebrated each milestone as if he were their own kin. Blake was a fair and generous employer, respectful of her position and careful never to overstep boundaries. But Lillian became increasingly aware of his presence, the way his eyes followed her movements, how he found reasons to be in the kitchen when she was baking, his thoughtful gestures that went beyond mere employer kindness. She found herself looking forward to their conversations over coffee after the hands had gone to work, discussing books they'd both read or sharing stories of their childhoods. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't since James died, and sometimes, when their eyes met across the dinner table, she felt a connection that both thrilled and terrified her. One December evening, as Lillian was finishing the dishes after supper, Blake entered the kitchen with an envelope in hand. "Letter came for you today," he said, holding it out to her. "Ryder brought it from town." Lillian recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. "Thank you," she said, wiping her hands on her apron before taking it. Blake nodded, lingering as if wanting to say more. "Everything all right with Thomas tonight?" Sleeping soundly, she confirmed. "Mrs. Wilson from town was kind enough to watch him this afternoon while I did the baking. I think she wore him out completely." "Good woman, Mrs. Wilson." Blake shifted his weight, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Lillian, I was wondering if you might join me for a cup of coffee in my study. After you've read your letter, of course." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "Of course, I'll just be a moment." In the privacy of the empty dining room, Lillian opened her mother's letter. It contained the usual family news, questions about Thomas, and concerns about Lillian's situation. But the final paragraph made her stomach tighten. "Your father and I worry about you alone in that wild country," her mother had written. "Cousin Eliza's husband has a position available in his mercantile in St. Louis. He would take you on out of family obligation, and you could live with Eliza until you find your footing. Please consider coming home, dear. A young widow with a child has no business in those territories." Lillian folded the letter carefully, conflicting emotions churning inside her. 6 months ago, she might have jumped at the chance to return to civilization, to the safety and comfort of family. But now, she glanced toward Blake's study, where lamplight spilled from the partially open door. Now, the thought of leaving Double Creek, leaving him, created an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the study and knocked softly on the doorframe. Blake looked up from his desk, his face warming at the sight of her. "Come in," he invited, rising to pull out a chair for her. "Coffee's hot." The study was Blake's private domain, lined with bookshelves and maps of the territory. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, casting a golden glow over the room. It felt intimate in a way that made Lillian both nervous and strangely at ease. "Good news from home?" he asked, nodding toward the letter she still held. "My mother wants me to return to Missouri," she said simply. "My cousin's husband has offered me work in his store." Something flickered in Blake's eyes, alarm, perhaps, or dismay. "I see," he said carefully. "And is that something you're considering?" Lillian looked down at the coffee he'd poured her, gathering her thoughts. "6 months ago I would have said yes without hesitation, but now." Blake prompted when she hesitated. She met his gaze directly. "Now I'm not so sure what I want." The silence between them hummed with unspoken words. Blake set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you, something important." Her heart began to pound. "Yes, I've come to care for you, very deeply." His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the vulnerability in his eyes. "And for Thomas, these past months with you both here have been, well, they've shown me what I've been missing in my life." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Blake, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve," he said with a small smile. "I know it hasn't been that long since you lost your husband. I know you're still grieving, and I respect that. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay in Arizona, it doesn't have to be as my employee." He reached across the desk, not quite touching her hand but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "It could be as my wife, if you'd consider that possibility." "Not now, perhaps, but someday." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything tonight," Blake assured her quickly. "It's not a decision to make lightly, He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of nervousness from the usually composed rancher. "I just couldn't bear the thought of you leaving without knowing how I feel." Lillian looked at this man who had entered her life on the night when she'd been at her lowest, who had rocked her baby until morning came, and changed the course of her future with his kindness. She thought of how he'd created a home for her and Thomas, how he treated her son as if he were precious and irreplaceable, how his presence had slowly healed parts of her heart she thought would remain broken forever. "James was a good man," she said softly. "He loved me and I loved him. When he died, I thought that part of my life was over." Blake nodded, a flash of resignation crossing his features. "But these months here," she continued, "watching you with Thomas, seeing how you lead this ranch, getting to know your heart." She took a deep breath. "I've found myself feeling things I never expected to feel again." Hope dawned in Blake's eyes. "Lillian, I'm not ready to give you an answer about marriage," she said honestly. "But I can tell you I have no intention of returning to Missouri. My home is here now. With you, if you'll be patient with me." The smile that spread across Blake's face was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "I've got nothing but time, Lillian Harper," he said softly, "and a heart that's yours whenever you're ready to claim it." Impulsively, she reached across the desk and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and full of promise. Spring came to Double Creek Ranch in a riot of wildflowers and new calves. Lillian watched from the porch of the main house as Blake lifted Thomas onto the saddle of his gentlest mare, the toddler squealing with delight as they walked slowly around the corral. "Careful with my boy," she called, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "Our boy," Blake corrected, looking up at her with such tenderness it made her heart swell. It had been a gradual transformation, the shift from yours to ours. Little moments building one upon another, Blake teaching Thomas to clap his hands, reading to him at night, carrying him on his shoulders to see new foals in the barn. Somewhere along the way, without formal adoption papers or declarations, Blake had become a father to Thomas in every way that mattered, and somewhere along the way Lillian had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with him. "Mama, look," Thomas called, his vocabulary expanding daily. "I ride." "I see you, sweetheart," she called back, her chest tight with emotion. At 15 months, Thomas was thriving, his father's curls and her determination making him a force of nature on the ranch. That evening, after Thomas was tucked into bed, Lillian found Blake on the porch of the main house, looking out at the stars. She joined him, accepting the blanket he draped around her shoulders against the cool night air. "He's going to be a fine horseman," Blake said, pride evident in his voice. "Just like his father," Lillian agreed softly. Blake turned to her, surprise and hope in his eyes. "Lillian," she took his hand, gathering her courage, "I've been thinking about what you asked me, about being your wife." His fingers tightened around hers. And I think it's time I gave you an answer." She moved closer, heart pounding. "If you still want us, Thomas and me, then yes. My answer is yes." Blake's expression transformed with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Are you certain?" He whispered against her hair. "More certain than I've ever been about anything," she assured him, lifting her face to his. "I love you, Blake Granger. You came into our lives on the darkest night and brought us morning. How could I not love you for that?" His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with all the longing and tenderness that had built between them over the months. Lillian melted into him, finally allowing herself to embrace this second chance at happiness without reservation or guilt. When they parted, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I promised to rock your baby until morning came," he said softly. "Now I want to promise to love you both for all the mornings to come." "That's a promise I'll hold you to," Lillian whispered, sealing the vow with another kiss under the vast Arizona sky. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Thomas toddling down the aisle ahead of them, scattering wildflower petals with enthusiastic abandon. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, pride and approval evident on their weathered faces as Blake and Lillian exchanged their vows. Life at Double Creek continued to flourish under their partnership. The ranch expanded, prosperity flowing from Blake's business acumen and Lillian's efficient management of the household. Thomas grew strong and confident, the beloved son of the ranch, equally at home in the saddle or helping his mother in the kitchen. 2 years after their wedding, Lillian gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, who had her father's blue eyes and her mother's quiet determination. Blake spent the first colicky nights walking the floor with her, rocking his daughter with the same patient tenderness he had once shown her brother. "I'll rock her until morning comes," he promised the exhausted Lillian, echoing words spoken years before. "You rest, my love." And as Lillian drifted to sleep, the sound of her husband's gentle humming soothing their daughter in the next room, she thanked whatever twist of fate had brought Blake Granger to her door on that desperate night. From the deepest darkness had come the brightest dawn, a new family, a new love, and mornings filled with promise for as far as she could see.